Her two-pronged social enterprise helps organizations attract diverse candidate pools and institute strategies that attain and retain top talent, making their workforce stronger and smarter and their programs more sustainable and relevant. Simultaneously, Cream City Conservation Corps cultivates the next generation of land stewards by introducing and training traditionally underrepresented teens and young adults in ecological careers. August has connected thousands of youth and young adults to hands-on service to public lands, outdoor recreation, and first-time employment experiences during her 14 years of youth program management experience and 9 years of helping local and national organizations such as the Stoops Conservation Association, the U.S. Forest Service, Milwaukee County Parks, develop outdoor programs that are culturally relevant and inclusive. Her talk is Equity and Inclusion in the Environmental Field, or 4 reasons your environmental organization is still predominantly white. Please welcome August Hall.
Good morning, everyone. So I brought a step stool just in case, but I feel like I might not need it. So this podium is suited for us vertically challenged people. How are you all feeling today?
Good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for allowing me this platform today and allowing me to speak so candidly about an issue that is very, very close to my heart. So, as was mentioned, I've been in the conservation and youth program development space since 2004, when I got my start with AmeriCorps. Through AmeriCorps, I worked on service learning curriculum development and volunteer corps team leading. And from there, I got the opportunity to work with numerous organizations, such as the SCA. Now, just like a relationship moving past the infatuation phase, as I fell deeper and deeper in love with this work of conservation, I started to also see the flaws. Not just with the movement of environmentalism itself and the natural resource management itself, but with the very process of how we do this work, how it's funded, and most importantly, who's recognized for their contributions. Before I outline the work that I do with Cream City Conservation, it's important that I share with you the impetus for how and why we got started in the first place. So as I mentioned, I worked for the SCA for about 10 years, managing the Milwaukee chapter, so welcome to my home. The SCA does a fantastic job of connecting students to hands-on service to the land, and quite frankly, I couldn't have been more proud to be a part of it. As the years went on, I noticed that there was a huge disparity between the identities of our crew leaders and the identities of the students we worked with. Our crew leaders were predominantly white from rural and suburban backgrounds, and our crew members predominantly Black, Latino, and Hmong from Center City, Milwaukee. This was not a unique problem to Milwaukee, though, as programs in other cities were experiencing the same plight. Leaders were encountering experiences and difficult conversations that they weren't exactly prepared to navigate. Realizing that the magic of nature was not enough to bridge that divide, we implemented a training program to better equip our crew leaders with cultural awareness, conflict management, and historical context around environmental movements. We also implemented a strategic plan that addressed the diversity, equity, and recruitment strategies. And as you can see from this photo, these are some of our crew leader apprentices who were too young to become crew leaders, but too old to remain as crew members. Almost overnight, our candidate pool for crew leaders began mirroring the demographics of our city. If you're familiar with the SCA, you know that they have community and national programs, and the national program model is unpaid. Members have to pay their own flight and buy and bring their own camping gear and work in a national park or a U.S. forest for the summer. I'm sure you can paint the picture of who can afford to pay their own way and volunteer their physical labor for an entire summer in some faraway land. The community program was instituted years later as a means to diversify the organization. With the community program, the members are paid a stipend, they arrive at work daily, and work in a local county or city park and go home each day. While we did have scholarships for our community members to participate in a national crew, being often the only crew member of color and fielding questions from innocent co-members in a foreign space like, "Are you in a gang? Do you do drugs?" while hiking up Yosemite was not exactly the experience many of my crew members wanted to sign up for. Because we still wanted our crew members to have an experience of working and living on the land in a national park or forest, a fellow program manager based in Detroit and I created partnerships with our local U.S. Forest Service office, which resulted in fee-for-service hybrid crews. This meant that for a few weeks out of every summer, members could work in their local neighborhoods, completing revitalization projects, building trail, removing invasives, and for the rest of the summer, they would be sent to national parks and U.S. Forest Service areas like Ottawa and Chewamaga and Nicolet. Beautiful, beautiful places here in Wisconsin. At these locations, they would live and work on the land for 1 to 3 weeks at a time, sharing their experience with peers they had built a connection with. I was so proud of the experience, and another year passed, and I was told I would need to reduce the number of crews I hired because we didn't have enough funding to cover crew transport. Having the Napoleon complex that I do, I was not ready to say no. So, just to give you a little background, on average, we have about 100 high school students and 22 adult crew leaders every summer. So it's a lot of personalities to manage, but luckily for me, I'm a sociologist by trade and I love people. So I called up my friends at Escuela Verde, which is a local charter MPS school here in Milwaukee, and asked if I could borrow a fleet of their bicycles. And because us Milwaukeeans always have each other's backs, they said yes immediately. And even put me in touch with an organization here in Milwaukee that provides free bike safety training. And with that, we had our first bicycle crew. Now, I must say, getting approval from our risk management, however, was not so smooth. I can only imagine the conversations happening at headquarters. Like, what does August want to do now? Teenagers on bikes with loppers. But it was absolutely worth it because the bike crew sparked conversations around alternative forms of transportation, city planning, and even nutrition as fuel. By early spring 2016, I was on cloud 9. We had 3 innovative programs, and I thought the sky was the limit in what we could accomplish. Right before summer that year, I, along with our Detroit program manager, were called to the Chicago headquarters for what I thought was a conversation about a raise. It turned out to be the notice that after that summer, both of our city's programming would be shut down due to lack of funding. Awkward. So have you ever experienced a tragedy and for some reason your response to that tragedy just doesn't match the situation? So as I'm sitting across from my colleague who's bursting into tears, I burst into laughter because I couldn't even fathom what was happening. It just seemed so ironic. But don't worry, the tears came later on my train ride back to Milwaukee. So for weeks, I procrastinated telling the crews that this would be their last summer. I didn't have the heart to tell those kids that after all these years, their dreams of becoming crew leaders themselves just wasn't going to happen. And this is the picture of the last blue shirts in Milwaukee. So while my heart broke in a million pieces that day, magically, little sprouts of possibilities sprung up where those pieces fell. I'm a firm believer that if you know the what, the how will reveal itself in perfect time. So, having had the experience of the rug being pulled from under me simply because the person who controlled the purse strings didn't find value in what we were doing, I knew I didn't want to start another nonprofit. In fact, I knew that the way to make true systemic change was to help build the capacity amongst all environmental organizations as far as I could reach, but starting with Milwaukee. So in the fall of 2016, I founded Cream City Conservation, a two-pronged social enterprise that helps environmental and community-based organizations address internal factors that contribute to the racial homogeny in their workforce. The profits from this work help support Cream City Conservation Corps. The CORE program model employs young adults ages 15 to 25 in environmental spaces, addressing green infrastructure, urban agriculture, and conservation work. We target recruitment of CORE members whose social identities are grossly underrepresented in the environmental field. So on one hand, we're preparing the next generation of conservation and environmental leaders, and on the other, we are preparing the existing green industry to be ready for them. So now this all sounds well, right, from a moral perspective, but I want to make the economic case for diversity. Organizations with racial and ethnically diverse work teams financially outperform homogeneous ones by 35%. But diversity alone doesn't do it. There must be a culture of inclusion. Data shows that organizations that promote diversity as a value retain staff that are more innovative, resilient, better at problem solving, and have a broader pool of skills and experiences to pull from. Despite this knowledge, 97% of our organizations still fail to produce leadership teams that reflect the diversity of our nation. And here's why. We do not have buy-in from the dominant group. Diversity is not only the differences among us, diversity is the differences in how we are treated in this world. Unfortunately, however, diversity is often used as a euphemism for people of color. So on average, a white, able-bodied, straight male unconsciously tunes out when they hear the word diversity because they've been conditioned to think that that word has nothing to do with them. If we are ever going to move the proverbial needle and get to a point where at least 2 out of our every 10 people in the environmental industry are of color, we need the dominant counterparts to become active allies. Now, while diversity is not limited to Black versus brown folks, it's critical that we intentionally engage in this conversation for a few reasons. One, being that most Americans would rather talk about disparities related to ability, gender, even sexuality, over talking about racial disparities. This is because our relationships tend to be racially homogenous. It's a lot easier to have empathy for identities you can understand and put a familiar face to. The second reason why this is important to lead with race is that it's the demographic with the largest disparity, not only in the environmental sector, but across industries. So today, while we're going to focus primarily on racial diversity, because frankly, unless we intentionally have a conversation about it, it doesn't happen, I also want you to keep in mind that color is not the only determining factor for diversity. So some things to keep in mind as we move forward with this talk is that our world is changing. In 2 years, over 50% of our nation's students, children, will be children of color. Now, some of us aren't very excited about this news. In fact, some of us are really upset. And this is because often, this reality of our changing world is coming at a point where we're starting to think that majority equals power. And we know that that's not true. In fact, we know that majority doesn't equal power because we saw it happen in apartheid. Unfortunately, however, I think these folks maybe misclassed that day. Now, there are a slew of myths that are related to people of color in our industry that perpetuate our inability to get them on payroll. The first myth is that people of color are simply too busy being poor to concern themselves with environmental issues. As Dr. Dorcetta Taylor of Diverse Green and the University of Minnesota points out, Black culture is often conflated with poverty culture. It's a very lazy way of hiking around the rockier points of racism and discrimination. It's also a really convenient way to filter people out of a job applicant pool. The truth, however, is that people of color care deeply about the environment and the impacts of climate change. We understand the urgency and these threats because typically we experience them daily. In fact, when a bipartisan poll partnered to complete a national survey of registered voters to assess public attitudes towards conservation, the numbers completely dispelled this myth. In nearly every category, people of color outranked white voters in their support of environmental protection. And as you can see here, whether it be pollution of our rivers, lakes, and streams, climate change, toxins and pesticides in our food and water, pollution of our oceans, loss of habitat for fish and wildlife, and loss of our natural areas. The second myth is that people of color simply aren't qualified to do this work. And even if they were qualified, they aren't interested. The truth, however, is that if you believe people of color don't care about the environment and aren't interested in these careers and don't have the skills and the academic backgrounds for these jobs, then naturally, those aren't the people you're going to seek out and recruit and hire. Dr. Dorcetta Taylor's research also dispels the myth of lack of interest in Diverse Green's 2.0 report entitled The State of Diversity in Our Environmental Organizations. You can download the full report and summary for free, so I definitely recommend that you give that a Google before you leave here today. Another reason our industry has been so suboptimal in connecting with people of color and getting them on payroll is, frankly, we're speaking two different languages when it comes to the environment. If we look at our history, in the wake of the 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King, civil rights activism was waning. Meanwhile, momentum was growing around ecological activism, with a lot of hype around organizing for Earth Day. Many African Americans were concerned that funds and resources needed for civil rights reforms were being diverted to new environmental causes. It's not that people of color opposed environmental activism, they simply didn't want it to come at the expense of human rights. Which, if you know the violent history of how our national parks and public lands were established via the removal of First Nations from their homes, you know that it absolutely did come at the cost of human rights and lives. So, knowing our history is one step in the right direction, but what do we do now? So, thank you so much for your patience in me giving you a little bit of that background. And as we look at that as the basis and the foundation for our understanding of how we got to where we are today, I'm now going to explore with you some of the top 4 reasons that our organizations are still predominantly white, despite our best efforts, why that's a problem, and what all of you can do about it within your organizations. So the number 1 reason is that we're relying on good intent. 75% of organizations say diversity matters, yet only 49% of those organizations say they were likely to support or take action to develop inclusive practices and programs that would create career pipelines for ethnic minorities. Unless we develop a strategic plan for recruiting and retaining top diverse talent, simply thinking diversity is a good thing isn't going to get the job done. Diversity is not just a nice to have, it is integral to ensuring the relevancy and sustainability of our organizations. The second reason is that you don't know how to recruit outside the club. People of color represent 38% of our nation's population. When your organization has a job opening, you probably communicate it via word of mouth and post the listing to traditional environmental websites, which are already predominantly white, instead of reaching out to minority-led organizations and attending minority professional gatherings to build your network. We also have to reevaluate recruiting from schools that are deemed best in class for your industry. Without much care or consideration into the school's diversity metrics. A degree from UW-Stevens Point should not be the sole determining factor of who is and isn't qualified to work for you. Instead of focusing on finding the best candidate, focus on building the best team. If you're constantly asking yourself what perspectives and experiences are currently missing from my team, you'll be more likely to see the value and benefit from diversity. Relationships take time and trust. Show up to spaces where you might be the minority for once in a while. It doesn't even have to be a space directly in your industry. Connect. Ask how you can help move their work forward. I promise you'll find some intersection. In fact, I encourage you to go outside your norms, and here's why. Genius is equally distributed, but access is not. And if you can't find genius in all people and in all places, it's because you don't actually believe it exists. And if you don't believe talent exists beyond your preconceived notions, you'll never find qualified candidates that aren't clones of your existing team. Now, people of color, I think there's some of you out there. You're not off the hook either. So as people of color, we are a part of groups and networks that our white colleagues simply may not have access or knowledge of. We need to be communicating these spaces as well. The third reason is that you don't have a pipeline. JFK once said, "We may have all arrived here on different boats, but we all breathe the same air now." Well, that's not exactly true, is it? The air that a brown child breathes living next to a gas station in Center City, Milwaukee, is not the same air that a white kid breathes from suburban Waukesha living next to a creek. We have to stop waiting for people of color to come to us. Unfortunately, those before us made it pretty clear that people that look like me weren't welcome in these spaces. And I get it. It's not fair. None of us in this room made these calls, right? No matter what side of the spectrum we're on. But the reality is, we showed up and we inherited this mess. And it's ours to deal with now. It's not an accident that people of color are dwindling off after internships or found relegated to the lower echelons of our organizations. In fact, we know that intentional pipelines work because we've seen it bridge the gender gap in leadership among green organizations. In fact, across the board, the current gender split right now is roughly 50-50, with the exceptions of presidents and board chair positions. The fourth reason is that, so let me just back up a little bit actually. I don't know if any of you guys watch HGTV, but it's my guilty pleasure. Much to my husband's chagrin. So if these guys, right, showed up to, or actually maybe let's paint a picture. These guys gave you a phone call and said, guess what? You've just won a total home makeover, right? You probably wouldn't invite them and their camera crew and the renovation team into your home with dirty dishes in the sink and dirty laundry on the floor, right? Like, you'd clean it up before they got there, right? Same thing goes for our diversity initiatives. We can't just give our websites an MTV facelift and start going on a recruiting rampage for diversity without actually doing the internal adaptive work that is necessary to make our environmental organizations inclusive. We have to be able to identify and eradicate toxic internal company cultures that contribute to a homogenous workforce. Put another way, it's simply not enough to think that racism is bad. We have to actively be anti-racist. So here's another thing that I really want you to consider also. If you don't create an environment where people of color feel like they belong, they will leave. In fact, worse yet, if you can pay them enough, which if you work for a nonprofit or government, that's probably not the case, they will stay and they'll assimilate for survival. But you will never benefit from their experiences and their perspectives. They'll be relegated to a mere token, and your organizations will stay the course of pale, male, and stale. Thank you for laughing. Wasn't sure how that one was going to go. So my point here is that we can't sprinkle in diversity as if we're adding in the forgotten seasoning to a stir fry. We have to create programs that are equitable and promote an internal culture of inclusion. So to recap, we have to set goals, not aspirations. We have to recruit outside the club, or in other words, establish equitable recruitment strategies. We need to create an internal and intentional pipeline. And for the love of all that is good and green, we got to clean it up. Thank you so much.